The Reluctant Saint, an original short novel by Joseph J. Murphy. Chapter 1: The Curse of Longevity. Zyonie and Bethany did not want to be there. Zyonie knew it because of her experience. She had been to more than one funeral in the past and had an honest recollection of at least three, the first being her great-aunt. The one the girls used to call Tilly. That first memory of confronting death embedded itself the deepest in her brain, and she remembers the yellow hue of the walls, the white lining of the coffin, and the strange mixture of perfume and cologne on the other people in attendance. She also remembers the feeling of solitude when she knelt next to the casket, looking at death wearing the taut skin of her deceased family member. The calm of Tilly's body was a stark contrast to the unnerved feeling Zyonie felt while trying to pray for the safe entrance of her great-aunt's soul into heaven. She was 7 years old at that funeral. And although Bethany had already been born, it was deemed that a 3-year-old had no place at the funeral parlor. 20 years later, both stood in silence while the line of people moved forward to pay their last respects to their father. Bethany, who made it a point to be well-read, found the notion of paying last respects to be a terrible corruption of language. She would still think fondly of her father and did not need nor want to be present among extended family members who seemed to either seek distraction from the imminent reality of the funeral or appeared to be in the grips of their emotion for the memories of the deceased. Her only consolation was that she was near her sister, because the working world left her little time to see her in the last 2 years. Zyonie had made the attempt to contact Bethany in the days following the news regarding their father's illness, but the younger sister, ill-suited for the news, chose to throw herself into her work rather than hear how the chemo had deteriorated her father's body. The emotional strain would have brought her to a standstill, and that was something she could not afford. She pressed on and only called her mother twice in the 3 months prior to his death. 2 days ago was when he died, and she still had not cried. She figured she needed to be at the funeral so she could break from the shock she knew she was in, but she knew she did not want to be there. The sisters stood next to their mother as the mourners progressed to kneel by the coffin and then to hold their mother's hand and speak their condolences. Zyonie always respected her mother's poise and guessed that there was ample strength fortifying her gentle tones. She felt tears well up in her eyes while she stood there, not for her loss, but because she pictured what her mother's life would be like now without her partner. She despised the notion of her mother being lonely, but could not chase the idea from her mind. The feeling was overwhelming, and her tears began to flow. Bethany looked at Zyonie and could only see the helpless look of sadness. The helplessness of her older sister crushed her countenance, and with that her own emotions stirred and boiled to the surface. Both sisters cried on either side of the widow, who put her arms on the shoulders of her girls, and with as much comforting as she could muster from within her own tears, said, "Ah, it's as it should be. His girls crying at his funeral." The procession of mourners continued, and the funeral eventually ended. The burial was the most difficult, as the moment was steeped in the absolute of death. Zyonie was the pillar upon which their mother leaned, but the finality of the moment shook Bethany to her core. She tried to think beyond herself, and could find no example to base her reaction on, nor could she find any resolve to the sinking feeling in her abdomen attached to the terrible loss of her father. All the love and hatred she had felt toward him while she was growing up rushed into her mind, and the only obvious thought was that the futility of life is how the world moves on even when people cease to be. She did not believe, in that moment, that she would ever find justifiable reason to ever be happy again. Life seemed pointless and so cruel in that the pointlessness was all there was to balance against the certainty of death. And it was that thought that gave way to her recognition that it was indeed her father's body being interned into the ground. A hollowness, the likes of which she had never before experienced, overtook her, and the emptiness seemed to pull her focus outward and out from her. The air she breathed became difficult to pull into her lungs, and a low-pitched hum overtook her ears. She felt her arms become warm and her forehead become cold. A blotchy blackness appeared in her vision, and she distinctly felt the world shift around her before she was engrossed in darkness. She came to with her head in the lap of her sister. They were still at the cemetery, and her mother was telling the group that those who were calling on their mobile phones could end the calls for medical help. A cousin's boyfriend offered an unopened bottle of water, and Zyonie gently poured some into her sister's mouth, talking with her as she did. "Were you just trying to distract everyone with that faint?" she asked jokingly. "I might have to claim that to avoid embarrassment," Bethany said, brushing the bottle away. "Who faints anymore?" Zyonie persisted, and Bethany took some water and then sat up. She took some water in her hand and rubbed it on her face while claiming her regained strength. Zyonie sat on the ground with her while folks began moving back towards their cars. They both looked at the grave with no words spoken. Bethany put her head back onto Zyonie's lap. "I'm going to miss him." With a half smile and tears beginning to form, Zyonie looked at her younger sister. "I know." And then they sat and cried.